So today we're going to dive into a topic that I think is something that affects so many of us, our hips. And I'm going to be sharing today 3 keys to having happy, healthy hips. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about, various conditions that could be going on with your hips, but mostly I'm going to be diving into those 3 keys along with some essential exercises to help you to stay strong and mobile. And this is going to be for you. If you're struggling with anything from, say, just tight hip flexors, you know that you sit too long throughout the day, or maybe you get really sore after a workout. Possibly you're waking up in the middle of the night with pain in the side of your hip. There could be a lot of things going on there, and I'm not going to get into all of the specifics today about what may be going on with you, but we are going to be just talking about how to keep your hips healthy and strong to avoid also having future issues. Because as you may know, it is really common these days to get a hip replacement, and there are definitely ways that you can avoid that. So say you have a family member that's had a hip replacement and you're wondering if you're going to be next in line. Well, I'm here to tell you some really good news that if you do the right things, the right treatments, which and the way that I teach that is through movement, through the right exercises, the right nutrition, and also the right mindset, then you can definitely avoid getting a hip replacement, because I've helped many clients do that. My clients that have worked with me have been worried about needing to get a hip replacement, or they've even been told by their doctor that they're going to have to do that very soon in the near future. And we just worked together for anywhere from 3 months to a year. Everyone's body is different. No one, had a full transformation overnight, but for most people, they started to feel improvement within a couple weeks. After 3 months, their symptoms really started to diminish. And then many of them were able to avoid getting a hip replacement. And so that's why this is really important to talk about. And even if you have had to get a hip replacement, there are still ways that you can, first of all, keep your other hip healthy so that you can potentially avoid having to replace the other hip, because that's very common. But there's still ways to keep your hips healthy and pain-free so that you can still do the activities that you love to do. And again, if you're jumping on to this live stream, please comment where you are joining us from today, and if you are resonating with this topic. And you can also make any requests, so anything that you want to maybe cover a little bit more in depth. If you're here on the live stream today, then this live stream is for you, so feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Okay, so let's start with the big issue that most people struggle with when it comes to their hips and keeping them healthy and pain-free, which I think most of us know is going to be sitting. In our modern lifestyles, most of us just sit way too much throughout the day. And I'll have to say that I am also guilty of this as well. I've been sitting way too much, doing a lot of computer work, working on a specific project, and I know better than to sit in one position for too long throughout the day. But you get really focused on a task or on a project, and it can be really hard to get up and to do what you need to do to move your body, and to not get too stiff or tight by being in one position for too long. So I know it can be challenging to have to, stop what you're doing, get up and move. But that is literally what's going to save your hips, because we were not meant to be in one position throughout the day. I've said this many times, so if you know me, if you work with me personally, or you've seen these live streams before, you know I've said it before, but lack of movement is one of the worst things we could be doing for our physical health. And not just that, but we really need to vary our movement. So if you work at a desk and you have gone from sitting at your desk to standing at your desk, unfortunately, that is not really solving the problem, because the main problem is that we need to vary our position throughout the day. So one of my mentors, Katie Bowman, she wrote the book Movement Matters, along with many other amazing books. Definitely recommend checking out her work, but she calls it nutritious movement. So what is your movement diet? And we need our movement micros and our movement macros. And most of us focus on our movement macros, which means, okay, well, I'm gonna get up from sitting at my desk for 8 hours and then I'm gonna go exercise at the gym and move my body that way. But then sometimes what do folks do is they get on a Peloton bike. Well, that's just more sitting. And the problem with sitting, I'm going to also tell you from an anatomical and a biomechanical perspective, is that it shortens and tightens our hip flexors. Well, what exactly does that do? Well, what it does is when our hip flexors are short and tight, it is going to shorten our psoas. Many of you probably already know what the psoas is, but if you don't, it is a very deep muscle, and it goes from the kind of inner thigh, the top of the femur, to our spine. It goes all the way up to our diaphragm. So it attaches through all of the lumbar vertebrae. It literally goes through the diaphragm. So when we're sitting throughout the day, that muscle is shortened. It's in a shortened position, and that is going to cause it to stay in that shortened position. Okay, and that's going to affect our breathing. It can affect our gut, and it's definitely going to affect our hip health. But one of the other issues with sitting when it comes to our muscles is we have another muscle, which is called the rectus femoris. So it's a quad muscle. Quadriceps are the muscles in the front of our thigh. Okay, so these muscles right here are our quadriceps. I'm going to switch to this so I see if you can see me or not. And the rec fem is a muscle that goes from the knee, it goes all the way up to the hip, and it attaches inside of the actual hip joint, okay? And so what that means is its job is to help stabilize the hip. But if that muscle is also short and tight from sitting too much throughout the day, it's going to be pulling on the head of the femur, head of the thigh bone. The thigh bone is your femur, okay? This bone right here. So when that happens, that is pulling your femur forward in the hip socket, okay? And that is going to create uneven wear and tear or degeneration in the hip joint, because it's basically rubbing on that surface, which is the cartilage of your hip. It's rubbing on that surface over and over and over again. So if you think about the tires on your car, if you don't get those tires rotated, it's going to create uneven wear and tear on your tires. And this is the same thing that can happen in our hips when we shorten these muscles through sitting. But even if I would say sitting like this all day, that's not necessarily better. That's also going to cause the muscles to be in one position throughout the day, which isn't good either. So we want to vary our position throughout the day. That is the key. And I do have a workbook on this, and I give you some exercises in the workbook that you can do that'll help strengthen your core, your glutes. And I also give you some tips to kind of think about ways that you can incorporate more movement throughout your day. You can vary your movement throughout your day. I give you some ideas for your work setup, different ways that you can move from the floor to standing to seated. And it's very thorough. So if you would like that workbook, you can comment workbook below and I will send you my workbook. It's called the Computer Body Burnout Workbook. Okay, so we talked about why sitting is the culprit for a lot of hip issues, problems in our hips. We talked about because of that tightness in the psoas and the hip flexors and how that can lead to degeneration in the hips and also can just be uncomfortable, okay? So if you've ever traveled to like India or even Japan, there are many cultures where people still squat throughout the day, not as an exercise, but literally to read the newspaper. So I spent a lot of time in India and I was amazed by how somebody could be reading a piece of paper here and be in this position like this, right? And some of these folks are not young either. They are in their hundreds. It's pretty incredible. If you haven't seen the Blue Zone documentary, I would definitely suggest checking that out, where it goes into this cultures where people still squat, and not just for a short period of time, but throughout their life, into their old age, into their hundreds. They live a long, long time because healthy joints equals longevity, right? And if you're squatting throughout the day, your digestion's probably going to be pretty good as well. And so that's going to be my first key. My first key is mobility. And a lot of people think of squats as a strengthening exercise. It just depends on how you're, doing a squat. And it can be mobility and it can be strengthening. It can be both. So if you're not able to get down onto the floor and do a full squat, there are ways you can work up to that. And granted, not everyone is going to be able to do this position, maybe ever. It just really depends on your body, but there are ways that you can work on getting into a full squat, and that would mean to have ankles that dorsiflex, that are mobile enough to allow you to get into that position. And it also means obviously enough hip flexion so that you can get into that position. So when I work with clients, that's one of the things we do, is we don't just work on their hip mobility. If they're having, like, say, hip pain, we also work on their ankle flexibility, because that's going to help them with their squats. And you squat every day, right? So if you're ever getting up and down from a chair, you're squatting. If you're sitting down on the toilet, you're squatting to get down and to get up. So we do squat, throughout the day, and that is also an exercise. When we get up and down from our chair, we can do that in a conscious way, in a mindful way, where we use that as an opportunity to, like I said before, mobilize and strengthen our hips. So that would be another one of my suggestions, is to use that opportunity when you get up and down from your chair, like you're doing a squat. Well, you might as well do 5 more right there. If you're going to get up, might as well get up and down 5 times. And there you go. You've just done 5 squats that you didn't do before. So bam. And this is what's how we want to reframe things, is how can we incorporate more movement throughout the day? Because for a lot of people, when they're told that they need to do like a full hour routine to get strong, healthy hips and to get out of pain, well, that's really overwhelming. Not everybody has an hour a day to do that. So I like to think about it as, well, how can you take what you're already doing throughout your day? You're already going to be getting up and down from a chair. And how can you turn that into an exercise, right? Now, as you see here, I'm sitting on the floor. And for a lot of people, this is a really uncomfortable position to be in. And it's uncomfortable because we don't do it, right? So if you don't use it, you lose it. And that is true definitely for the body and for our joints. So I always tell my clients, try sitting on the floor at some point in your day, whether it's playing with your kids. That's always a great opportunity because you're going to be playing with your kids anyway, hopefully. And so you can get on the floor with them, you know, and maybe you want to emulate what they're doing. You want to follow them, let them lead you. Kids are great coaches. They're great personal trainers. So that way you can incorporate more movement right there. Another way you can do it is you can put your computer either in your lap or have a computer stand. Try to do a little bit of work sitting down on the floor, or you could try watching TV sitting down on the floor, okay? Now, if your knees are really hurting and everything's hurting like crazy when you're down here, then that means you're not ready to be sitting on the floor yet, and you'll want to be working on some exercises first that will prepare you for being able to sit on the floor. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of those exercises that you can do that are easy exercises to do, but they're powerful because, like I said earlier, we want mobility, we want strength in the hips. Those are the first two keys, and then we also want alignment. So as I was mentioning before, the tight quads can pull the head of the leg bone forward in the socket, and that's going to cause uneven wear and tear in the joint. That can potentially cause degeneration there and pain in the hip flexors. So we want to stretch that out, open, and mobilize that so that way we can create a better alignment in the hip joint, because all hips want congruency. If you watched last week's live stream, I talked about frozen shoulder and how the shoulder is like a golf ball on a tee. It has this very small articular surface. Well, our hip joint is a much larger joint, but it's also a ball and socket joint, okay? So your hip joint was also meant to have that nice circumduction or circular movement that we don't often do in life, because how many of us are doing this kind of movement throughout the day, right? So now that I'm on the floor, I'm going to show you a nice way that you can work to lubricate your hip joints. Our hip joints are just like any other machine. They want to be well oiled, well lubricated. And when we lose that fluidity, that lubrication in the hip joint, what happens is, because that cartilage isn't getting that nice lubrication, it starts to dry out and it starts to crack, and that leads to arthritis, degeneration, all those things. So when we're doing this circular movement that the hip joint was designed to do, we are helping to actually stimulate the production of synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is that lubricant. It's like the oil that your car runs on. We need to change the oil, and this is the way we do it. Clean the oil. So when I do this, I am producing more synovial fluid in my hip joint. I'm keeping a neutral spine as I do this one, and so that means I'm keeping my tailbone heavy. I'm not allowing my pelvis to rock forward and back, because now that's going to be creating movement in my back, and instead I'm trying to create movement in my hip joints primarily, without my back going along for the ride. Okay, so that one's called knee stirs. Try that one out. That's a really great exercise to do on a daily basis. All right, and then while you're there, you can do knee to chest. So knee to chest is just where you're hugging one knee in and really squeezing the knee in, because like I said before, we tend to sit with our hip 90 degree at a 90 degree bend, and instead we want to go through that full range of motion of the hip. So now I have it all the way up here towards 180 degrees. I'm going to pull, pull, pull. If that hurts, of course, you don't have to pull so hard. And if it hurts your knee, you can always try bringing your hands behind your thigh. But again, this is a position that our hip doesn't get to be in very often throughout the day. And what position am I in? Well, this is basically a squat, right? So this is a way that you can work towards a squat by doing it in a more passive way on your back, where it's less likely that you would, feel pain in this position. Okay, so those are two ways that you can mobilize and lubricate your hip joints. And now I'm going to show you a way that you can strengthen your glutes. Your glutes are the primary hip extensors, and that means they take your leg back in space, okay? And so when I do this, when I go into a bridge, I'm basically doing hip extension, right? I'm opening up the front of my hip, so that's nice and therapeutic for the hips. I'm also working my glutes, okay? So this is a great exercise for hip health. Many of you might already know this exercise and you might already be doing it. But what I'm going to show you here is potentially a little bit different. So some people, when they do this exercise, they really feel their hamstrings working a lot. Now, it's not a bad thing to work your hamstrings because our hamstrings need to work too. But what we want to feel are the glutes working. So when you come up to the top, you can try squeezing your glutes. If you have a hard time squeezing the glutes, you could try coming up to the top and pushing your heels down to feel your glutes a little bit more. And every time you fire those glutes, the glute max, it actually pulls the femur back in the hip socket. Okay, so that is really therapeutic for the hip because, like I said before, with short, tight hips, the femur is getting pulled forward. So this is the hip socket, right? And so the femur is getting pushed forward to the front of the hip socket, and it's creating that uneven wear and tear. Okay, so I'll show you in this position coming up into a lunge where now I'm stretching the front of my hip. Brought the camera a little too close to me so that you can't really see what I've got going on with my torso. But when we go into a lunge, I'm opening up the front of that hip. I'm drawing the femur back into the hip socket, firing my glute, right? And then I want to keep the glute turned on as I slowly begin to shift myself forward. Now, the common mistake that people make is they go into a lunge and they just kind of come forward with their torso. And what's happening there is you're losing first of all, you're losing the psoas stretch because the psoas attaches all the way up here to your ribs. So that's number one. But number two is that if you're going too far forward in your lunge, like here, yoga style, you're actually pushing the femur forward in the socket even more. And if you're already having some degeneration there in the hip or some pain because of arthritis, that might be even more painful to put your body in that position. So this is how I teach it. I'm going to go over it one more time so that it's crystal clear. You're going to start in your lunge. Torso is vertical. You're going to start to shift yourself forward until you feel that stretch through the front of your hip. But notice how I'm not I'm not sticking the butt out, I'm not tucking it under, and I'm trying to not allow the pelvis to really change. So as I come into my lunge, I'm trying to keep pretty much the same alignment in my back and in my pelvis, right? You actually might not feel like you're getting as deep of a stretch when you do it that way, but it's going to be, you're still stretching no matter what, because you're lengthening the attachments, the two attachments of the muscle away from each other, which is what a stretch is. And it's going to be more therapeutic for your hip because you're getting the stretch in the right places, where we really want to isolate those quadricep muscles, the rec fem that I spoke about earlier, and the psoas. Okay, so if you're doing this with me here, then go ahead and switch sides. Any specific questions about what's going on with your hips, I'd be happy to answer any questions here when I'm done demonstrating. So you can just pop those questions there in the chat box. So when we're going into the stretch, again, I'm drawing my ribs back. I'm even pulling my abdominals in. I'm lengthening my back. And then I'm sending my hips forward in space, trying to avoid overarching in the back or tucking under. Keeping neutral spine and just kind of finding that position where my pelvis stays the same. So if you have a hard time feeling that for yourself, what you can do is bring your hands onto your hips and come into that lunge and only go as far as you can maintain the feeling that your hips aren't doing this or that. So you should be able to feel that under your hands. Is my pelvis rotating forward or back? Okay, so hopefully that feels good. Great. All right, so just to recap, we went over the 3 keys to hip health, which is mobility, the right amount of mobility, the right amount of strength and stability, and the third one is alignment. We want to align the femur in the right position in the hip socket so that that joint is congruent and that we don't create uneven wear and tear in the hip socket, which leads to degeneration. And the way that we do that is by strengthening the glutes, is by mobilizing and lubricating the hip joints like I showed you. And another way that I suggested doing that is to make getting up and down from a chair, it's called sit to stand, making that an actual exercise, okay? So that you are using your glutes, you're, even strengthening, the quads as well when you do squats, obviously. But that's just an easy way that you can get more of this movement and mobility and strength into your day-to-day life without having to set aside a big chunk of time to go do some exercises. So I find it to be more effective, especially for folks that work in one position throughout the day, whether you're working on a computer sitting or standing. I think it's more effective to do movement throughout your day than do an hour of exercise after work. So see if you can find ways to fit that into your day-to-day life. And again, I have that workbook if you want some tips or ideas on how you can do this. Comment workbook and I will send that over to you. And before we end, I just want to get up and show you what that movement would look like if you're going to be doing the sit to stand as I was suggesting. Okay, so we're just going to kind of quickly go over the biomechanics of a squat so that you can practice that when you're doing your sit to stand and coming up and down from your chair. Okay, so biomechanics of a squat are, you want to think about reaching for the seat behind you with your sitting bones. So you can imagine here, even if you don't have a chair behind you, that you're going to sit down on the edge of a stool. That's the feeling. So I want to think about, I'm showing off my ducktail feathers, right? I want to avoid doing tucky butt. Instead, I want ducky butt. I'm reaching my hips back towards the chair behind me. That's one way you can feel your glutes working more in a squat and less in your quads, but a squat is a quad exercise, so you're definitely going to feel it there too. The other thing about a squat is you want to try to keep that neutral spine that we were just talking about in the lunge. So when you're coming down, you want to avoid overextending the back or, again, tucking under. Keep that neutral spine the whole time as you're going down and sitting in your chair and make that exercise. So I hope that gave you some ideas and some tips of how you could just be incorporating more movement throughout your day so that it doesn't feel like it has to be this huge thing, because when we set ourselves up like that, it can set us up for failure because it can feel like a lot to try to fit in that much exercise or that much movement throughout your day. Why not throw in, 5 squats every time you get up and down from your chair? And I think you'll really feel a difference in your hip health and your just the way you feel in general, because when we have happy, healthy hips, then just life is more easier, right? When we're not experiencing pain, easier to go about our day-to-day tasks in life and just feel better. And that's what I do. I help people to feel the best they possibly can in their bodies. I help people to recover from injuries and from chronic pain so that they can do the activities that they love to do, whether that's a sport and that's their why, or maybe it's just to be able to get down on the floor and play with their kids. So whatever that is for you, if you want more support with this, then feel free to reach out to me. You can comment hips below and I will reach out to you in Messenger and we can chat more about what's going on with you, because each individual is going to be so different. Everyone needs a different recipe of exercises that they can do that's really specific for their bodies, what's going on with them, and takes into account their health history, their movement background, any previous injuries or surgeries that they've had. And that's what I do in my movement and health assessment when I work with my clients. So whether it's one-on-one or in one of my group programs, we start with an in-depth health and movement assessment so that we can get you the right recipe of exercises that was developed just for you. So go ahead and reach out to me if you're interested in that. And otherwise, I will see you on the next one.